When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
There's some ambiguity there. Is Paul saying, oh yeah, these things that people call gods, but we know there's only one God? Is Paul saying that? Or is Paul saying, yeah, there are these gods all over the place, but as far as we're concerned, only one God matters to us?
That is what he's saying.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan.
And I'm Dan Beecher.
And you are listening to the Data Over Dogma podcast, where we increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. How are things, Dan?
Things are going great. I'm having a good time. I did not get to travel this last weekend, however, and apparently you guys did. And
Yep.
I'm saying you guys because there's not just you here with us. Why don't you tell the people who we got here?
So we got the people's champ. My old friend David Burnett is joining us again. Welcome to the show, David. I think it's our first time repeat guest. Is that accurate,
a returning champion.
A returning,
Wow.
Yes. So welcome to the show. Good to have you back. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah. And the reason...
I was just saying, I'm glad to be the first returner.
Yeah, and we're glad to have you back, and hopefully there will be more returners in the future. We are having you here because you and I just spent the first 3 days of the week hanging out together in lovely Providence, Rhode Island at Brown University. We were participating in a conference that we presented at as well as organized.
That's correct.
Yeah, and the weather was surprisingly, according to everybody who lived there, the weather was uncharacteristically nice, which was great.
It was really nice. Providence is beautiful. Yeah.
That was divine providence, is what that was. that you guys were given the green light from above.
Yeah.
To do this conference.
Well, I think that has to be where they got their name from, right? That Enlightenment era notion of providence.
Yeah, something like that.
Now I think we've mentioned the conference before. In fact, I think, David, the last time you were here, we talked about this. The conference is called The Meanings and Ends of Monotheism, and we had said we were going to live stream it. It turned out that wasn't going to work for everybody, but we did record it, and it will be released publicly later. But we wanted to have you on the show so we could just jam a little bit about the conference.
We're gonna scoop the recording. We're gonna get out in front of it and tell the people some of the cool stuff that you guys were able to talk about, and that your guests were able to talk about. So I think I'm excited to hear about it. I was gonna watch it streaming, and then it turns out that wasn't an option for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, in discussions and planning the conference, this has been a long time of planning ahead of time to work out the details. And for a conference like this, it very much was a scholarly workshop, style conference. So what we wanted from the conference and the sort of aims and goals of the conference, I think we accomplished better doing it this way, which is, this is something that scholars need to workshop these ideas and work together on and get good feedback on and discussion going and work out those ideas. And then we take our papers back, and there's going to be like a 6-month process before we get papers back in for them to like make any edits they need to and all of that. And then we're going to share them with the actual conference members so that we can actually get feedback on each other's work. And then this is going to become a published volume. So having it a small, intimate, scholarly conversation to work out those ideas and really test those ideas in in a highly saturated peer review environment, is really important, because if we say we believe in peer review and we say we believe in scholarship, then it needs to be done properly. And that takes a long time. And so if it's done right, it takes a long time. And so that's the nature of the beast, because, like you, Dan's, I believe in accessibility. I want to work towards that in the future as well, and help bring scholarship to the masses. But for it to be done with peer review and worked out and established, has to become scholarship,
Yeah.
And so there is a critical mass of scholars who agrees with us on this, challenging the category of monotheism in the study of antiquity. And that's very much what this conference is about. I mean, the reason why we went with the name, the meanings and ends of religion, the S in ends is in parentheses. So it's a double entendre of sorts. It's the name comes from a famous Wilfred Cantwell Smith book called The Meaning and End of Religion. And in that book, it was popular in the 60s. This is going to be rehashed for some who've heard us discuss this before.
It was months ago. Nobody even paid attention back then.
But this is important. So the reason why we went with this name in particular, The Meanings and Ends of Monotheism, it's a play off that title, The Meaning and End of Religion by Smith. And what that book did in the 60s, what it was a part of, was a kind of a paradigm shift in religious studies to say, what this category of religion, the way it operates in modern discourse, scholarly discourse, is very much anachronistic to the study of the past. In other words, we're bringing assumptions, critical assumptions of modern scholars, and taking them back to antiquity and foisting them on ancient people that wouldn't share those same assumptions and those same categories when it comes to religion. And so the book was kind of saying that we shouldn't use the term religion at all in critical study when we look at these ancient communal traditions that are passed down and personal faiths of the peoples themselves. And that's how Smith sort of broke down the categories. But so what we were doing with the concept of monotheism, quote unquote, is saying that category hasn't faced the type of critical scrutiny that religion has in any way that is helpful in the study of antiquity. And so we wanted to help spearhead that movement. There has already been scholarship that's been critical of monotheism for some time. That is not new. But what we wanted to do was get together some of those scholars in one place, in one conference, and say, okay, let's take the gloves off, so to speak. Let's be straightforward with this and not dancing around the issue, but just get it right out there in the open and say, this category should not be used for the study of antiquity anymore.
Let's talk a little bit quickly about that category, about the idea of monotheism as it has been talked about up until now, and what it meant. And then a little bit about why you think that is an outdated way of thinking about, the beliefs and sort of practices of antiquity.
I think my paper probably goes most directly into trying to figure out what's the origin of this conceptual package.
This is fun. It's like, Dan, it's like I'm interviewing you too.
Yeah.
I'm interviewing
a guest
both
on
of you guys.
On my own damn show. So we first get the word monotheism in around 1660. A guy named Henry Moore, who's he's called a Cambridge Platonist or Platonist if you're nasty. He's one of these guys who's using Platonic philosophical frameworks to advance certain Protestant interests, particularly over and against the people who are perceived of as the enemy at the time, which included materialists like Thomas Hobbes, and people that they accused of being atheists and Muslims and things like that.
How dare they? What a horrible accusation to call someone an atheist.
But and they were like, oh, the materialists who worship the world as the one and only God are basically worshiping no God. They're all atheists. Right. So it's pretty complex when you drill down to the bottom of it. But they're using this concept of monotheism as a value judgment and an identity marker. And what I point out is that they're not using it to mean worship of one God. Like they kind of dance around it like this is what it means, but it's like, well, what about Islam? And then it's like that's a false pretense to monotheism. They're not true monotheists because they don't believe in the same God as us. And then, like I said, the materialists, because they believe in an impersonal single deity, they're also not believing in a real God, and so they're atheists. And so basically, we're monotheists, and anybody who claims to believe in one God, if their God is too different from our God, then they don't believe in the right one God, and so they're not monotheists. So what I do in my paper is I explain 3 different ways historically that the concept of monotheism has been used. So when it was coined, and I call this Enlightenment monotheism, it was basically this idea that there's this one personal, all-powerful, supremely sovereign, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God who created everything that exists apart from them out of nothing. And so one of the necessary features of Enlightenment monotheism is creation ex nihilo. Right. Which is, and like, we kind of think of this as, at least in the way I've seen it discussed, we kind of think of it as just this kind of doctrine that's there. Oh yeah, creation had to happen out of nothing. But this is huge. Anciently, when they're first debating this in the 2nd century CE, in the Enlightenment, if it's not creation out of nihilo, it's crap, as the great poet once said. But then you get in the 19th century, you get all these, like in the 18th, 19th century, that's when dictionaries were suddenly all the rage. And in Webster in 1928, I think this is the first time anyone ever defined monotheism as the belief in the existence of one sole deity. Prior to that, literally dictionaries defined monotheism as the doctrine of the Unitarians. Oh. Yeah. So like you look in the dictionary, monotheism, the doctrine of the Unitarians. Next word. And then Webster says it's belief in one single soul deity. And I suggest this is an etymological fallacy because it's never, up until that point, no one had ever said monotheism is this, and here you can apply it to all these different religions and you can distinguish monotheism from not monotheism. It was an identity marker and a value judgment. And
that's so weird because it does, like the word itself just sounds so easy to to break down. It mono, one, theism, God, easy, done, out the door. And so to hear that it wasn't that is a little bit shocking, to be honest with you.
And, the etymological fallacy is very, very common. People use it all the time in the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century. And then what I describe a third kind of monotheism, which is what I call, and you'll recognize this word, renegotiated monotheism. And this is where once we started noticing, hey, you know what, in the Bible, they kind of talk about all kinds of different gods. Then we had to be like, well, what does this mean about monotheism? And instead of saying, okay, that's not monotheism, we decided, oh, well, monotheism just means something else then. It means whatever we find in the Bible. And so you have these scholars who look in the Bible, and whether they're looking in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or whatever, they'll say monotheism is this, so that we can continue to identify this as monotheism. So they're revising the definition so that we can continue to call what is in the Bible monotheism.
It seems to have become important in the history of, especially of Christianity, to identify the Bible with the concept of a single God, with the concept with the belief in only one God at any given time.
Yeah, and in the paper, I argue that a big part of this, and what I think is probably the central part of this, is that as an identity marker and a value judgment, you want ideological continuity with these people who wrote the Bible that you believe you're a part of a continuation of the same community. You're the same group, and so you want them to believe the same things that you're believing now, and so. Monotheism is the beating heart of Christianity for a lot of folks, particularly when they're comparing it to other things that they don't think are monotheistic. And so obviously the authors of the New Testament had to be monotheistic. And I argue that scholarship today is trying to maintain that continuity, that connection, and they're willing to just revise the concept wherever they need to go with it in order to maintain that connection. And I argue that is harmful to the academic endeavor, and that we need to acknowledge that there's not monotheism in the Bible. And if we want to argue for the utility of that framework, that analytical framework, if we want to say there's value in imposing this interpretive lens on the Bible, they should make a case for why it's valuable. We should no longer just give the benefit of the doubt. We should no longer just default to accepting the monotheism of the Bible.
Exactly.
And so that's the gist of my paper. And I conclude by saying, and so if anybody wants to use this framework, they first need to demonstrate that there is value to it and that it's not just an attempt on their part to structure values and powers and boundaries and things like that.
And to support a sort of dogmatic stance, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what we're talking about is like now that word, that monotheism word, is being used to support a dogma rather than to actually, just look at what is present and take it as, on its own terms.
Yeah, and as you well know, the official position of the Data Over Dogma podcast is that data goes over the dogma rather than the other way around.
Right.
We don't let the dogma wag
the data.
Yeah.
I like that. That's a shirt right there. Somehow we got to turn that into a shirt. Don't let the dogma wag the data. Something. So David, what was it? Talk about what your paper. Did you give a paper also?
I gave a paper too. Yeah.
What was your paper about specifically?
Yeah, my paper was sort of a revised version of a paper I gave a couple years ago. Me and Dan were in a section at SBL on in the deuterocanonical and cognate literature section.
SBL. I'm just gonna jump in and mention that SBL is the Society for Biblical Literature.
Yes,
you're talking about
the Society of Biblical Literature. Yep.
Their yearly conference.
Years ago, at the Society of Biblical Literature, me and Dan gave similar papers to the ones we gave now. But the paper I did then is the paper I developed for this conference. Which was called Virtuous Gods or Deserving of Death, conflicting early Jewish postures towards the gods within ancient Mediterranean paganism. And so what I was trying to argue there, just briefly, is that when you look at a somewhat representative spectrum of early Jewish literature, so when I say early Judaism, I mean the Judaism of the Second Temple period, which is anywhere spanning back as far as 6th century BCE to like 1st century CE, the end of 1st century CE after the destruction of the temple. So generally speaking, when we look at early Jewish literature, we can find a spectrum of different postures towards the gods that are active in ancient Mediterranean world, and they largely vary. But when you look at these varying postures towards the gods, none of them, not even on either pole. So on one pole, you'll have someone like Philo of Alexandria saying things like, talking about the gods from sort of the Deuteronomic vision of the cosmos, where you have the gods apportioned over the nations that we have happening at the Tower of Babel scene. So in commentary on that text in Philo, in the context of like Platonic philosophical discourse about the scala natura, the scaled nature, the hierarchy of the cosmos, he comments on this text saying, "Yeah, those gods of the nations, those celestial bodies that Deuteronomy says is God, yeah, they're gods. They're rulers that are appointed over the Father of all, though. They are not the sole cause of everything themselves. And in this sort of critique of some Greek beliefs about the causation of all events to the celestial bodies, Philo critiques this and says, no, they're gods. Yep. But they are copying the rule. They're doing mimesis. They're imitating the rule of the Father of all. And this is standard fare in Platonic cosmology of the day, of, an ordered cosmos, everyone playing their part, keeping this perfect harmony thing. Well, Philo's on board and is like, yeah. And matter of fact, he goes as far to say that these gods, even though because they're rulers, like delegates under the Father of all, that makes them liable to correction because they're not the Father of all. They're not the head guy.
Right.
But so he says they're liable to correction, but he says because of their virtue, they're never destined to undergo it.
Okay.
So this idea that Philo is not an apocalypticist, right? I think I talked about this last time. Is there's no sense in which he sees some final end of days where the gods need to be judged and killed. There's none of that.
Right.
Okay. The gods aren't the issue. For Philo, he's sort of lampooning the Greeks who say that they're autocratic gods. He literally calls them that. He says, for the Greeks who say they're autocratic powers, they're wrong. They rule under the Father of all. So at no time in Philo, anywhere, does he negate the gods' existence, their agency, their rule that's delegated to them under the God of all, their regular place in ordering the cosmic government of sorts. All of that's very real, but they're virtuous for him.
Right.
But then if you fast forward on the other side and you go to Paul, this is totally opposite end of the spectrum here. Paul will use the exact same terms for the gods of the nations that from the Septuagint, from the Greek translations of the Jewish Bible, and commenting on same texts in a very different context, very different rhetorical goals, very different things taking place. These are epistles to specific communities, and he's an apocalypticist. So the context couldn't be more different.
Right.
But what's interesting is when those texts come up, they all affirm that those gods are in fact real and are in fact agents in the world. But for Paul, as this radical apocalyptic Pharisee that thinks it's waiting for the final denouement, the resurrection from the dead, this great event, included in that event is the judgment of what he calls principalities, powers, rulers. These are the same terms used in these other Greek Jewish literature for those gods that are delegated over the world.
So that's not so the final judgment isn't just for us humans, it's also for all of these other ancillary gods.
Oh,
interesting.
Yeah. So much so, it's so in your face that Paul actually uses the language of parousia to speak about the coming back of Jesus, where there's this final judgment of the cosmos. And he even includes the holy ones, he calls them, his fellow believers in Jesus who have received the pneuma from heaven, this heavenly spirit of the gods, so to speak. But it's the spirit of the high God, the most high God, that the Messiah himself shares. So that links them in some weird mystic cosmic way to them. And he says that you all are going to participate in this. Don't you know you're going to judge the cosmos? Don't you know you're going to judge the angels? Surprise. So that's part of their role. They're in the big judgment divine court scene at the end, and they're issued their judgment that they're going out the door, So that is a totally different picture than Philo. I mean, Paul would look like the crazy apocalypticist with the sign on the corner, right? The end is nigh, where Philo is sort of like the urbane, sophisticate philosopher, So you couldn't get more opposite in terms of the views of the gods. But here's the point. Even if you consider these radically different poles of postures towards these deities in their own lived context, in their own lived religious context, you're not going to find anything remotely close to anything we could call monotheistic.
Right.
In the way that term is generically employed today. And what I did say on top of that is when you consider all of the nuances that get added to this term in contemporary scholarship on early Judaism and Christian origins in particular, it dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. Because like Dan said, once that definition has shifted, some might say, oh, well, yeah, but in scholarship, it hasn't shifted, by ancient Jewish monotheism, or like an evolution of early Jewish monotheism into these Christological monotheism, whatever the heck that means. That these terms get employed all the time, but you have to qualify them all day long. And in every text you reference, there's always other divine powers everywhere.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Hey everybody, how has your 2024 been so far? We're almost halfway through. Did you set any goals at the beginning of the year? You've been tracking them? You've been able to celebrate any wins? You have anything coming up in the next 6 months that you're really looking forward to? A lot of people don't realize this, but something that can help us with setting, managing, and achieving our goals is therapy. I was over 40 years old before I ever set foot in a therapist's office, and I had to have friends report to me that it has been phenomenally helpful for them before I really took it seriously. And I've been using emotion-focused therapy, which has really helped me to better understand and manage my own emotions and better communicate about them with the people around me that I love. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. This is something that is entirely online. It is intended to be convenient and flexible and adaptable to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can even switch your therapists at any time for no additional charge. Visit betterhelp.com/dogma today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/dogma.
When Johann Rall received the letter on Christmas Day 1776, he put it away to read later. Maybe he thought it was a season's greeting and wanted to save it for the fireside. But what it actually was a warning, delivered to the Hessian colonel, letting him know that General George Washington was crossing the Delaware and would soon attack his forces. The next day, when Rall lost the Battle of Trenton and died from 2 colonial Boxing Day musket balls, the letter was found, unopened, in his vest pocket. As someone with 15,000 unread emails in his inbox, I feel like there's a lesson there. Oh well, this is The Constant, a history of getting things wrong. I'm Mark Chrysler. Every episode, we look at the bad ideas, mistakes, and accidents that misshaped our world. Find us at constantpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Isn't there even a problem with just saying Christological monotheism, in the sense that, like, if Christ is a god or is part of a godhead, that's plural, right?
Yeah.
Now suddenly we have a plural God in Christ and his God Father.
Well, and it manifests the problem, which is that monotheism isn't the rule that we're holding up. Monotheism is just an identity marker and a value judgment, and we will just massage it into whatever context we need that value judgment and that identity marker, whether it means inclusive monotheism, exclusive monotheism, ethical monotheism, Christological monotheism, first century Jewish monotheism, whatever we need it to be. If we need monotheism to be there, it's going to be there one way or another.
Right. And this is what happens here. Like Dan put it beautifully just then. It's like what tends to happen, these huge anachronisms take place in just a couple of sentences. I mean, people can bring entire categories that take hundreds of years to met out, to develop. And they'll just say, oh yeah, here it is. Look at this text. Doesn't this kind of sound like something that one day will become this? so it must be this, and
Right.
it's like, whoa, hold up. I mean, you take 1 Corinthians 15 is a great example of this. If a lot of the talk about Christological monotheism and things like this, when around the New Testament, all the EHCC folk use this language. This is the early high Christology club.
Oh, okay.
There's like a little club of scholars, that talk about this.
The idea that Jesus didn't slowly develop into being God, but immediately was understood as God.
That's right. First generation, right off the bat, everyone thinks that.
Mutation.
That's right.
Heroes on the half shell, Christology. It was.
But notice the nuances here. Notice the nuances. It's not a mutation of monotheism. Well, there's already this ancient Jewish monotheism where you have, okay, sure, there's these other gods, kind of, but they're created. See, there's only one creator, even though some of these Jewish texts in the Second Temple period didn't get the memo about creatio ex nihilo. They didn't get it, because they're like, oh yeah, the powers and the rulers, they're involved in ordering the world too and bringing it about and setting it in order. And it's like, I remember reading these texts in like my early master's degree, like, wait, what? Why are these powers involved in creation? Well, I thought God was the only one doing all this stuff,
Yeah. And even Jesus is like that. It's right. A lot of people misunderstand. It's created through Jesus or something like that. Jesus did the creating.
Which technically would be a Tuesday in the ancient Mediterranean, really.
Yeah.
I mean, because you have powers that Yahweh himself uses in these early Jewish texts to do all kinds of stuff in creation. I mean, wisdom as an entity that creates for God is there in Proverbs 8. And the early Christology folks that know that category is already well developed in Second Temple period. But anyways, the point is that we want to like sort of wipe all the anachronism off the table and say, let's just engage this literature and be critical about the use, the employment of this category. And a great paper that piggybacked right off of what Dan was talking about was towards the beginning by an amazing scholar, Deborah Scoggins Ballantyne, wonderful scholar, also of Brown, who teaches at Rutgers. She did a paper called Translating Monotheism, How a Lens of Monotheism Impacts Translation. And it just knocked out of the park exactly what Dan was saying about these
the first paper of the conference.
Yeah, it's the first paper of the conference. Talk about a way to start, But she knocked it out of the park with this concept of saying, look, when you have this developed category of monotheism already, where you assume that's what this religion is, that's what it's in the Bible, it's exactly what Dan was saying. Like, this is already monotheistic. When you go back to try to translate these texts, there's so much psychological influence over translation choices in very weird texts that don't fit any of those categories.
Yeah.
And so you see, and she shows like multiple translations, English translations and ancient translations, how this happens, how at different times when you have theological development and this lens of monotheism developed, it's influencing all kinds of translation choices. And you can see it. I mean, it's really obvious to historians and translators when you're made aware of it. Problem is, there are so many interpreters that probably weren't even aware that those lenses are already fully developed.
Right.
And so you couldn't imagine seeing it any other way, if you're does a fish know what's in water, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So this is why a conference like this is so important, is like, we have to try to take these lenses off and be critical with the data and look at it and say, wait a minute, does any of this fit?
Can you guys provide an example? Maybe the professor that you just named, I didn't catch her.
Deborah
name.
Scoggins Ballantyne.
Yeah, can you provide? Maybe she provided an example of of a scripture that has been traditionally translated one way, but would be better translated in another way if we sort of cast off the monotheism lens. Can you think of a specific example of that?
Well, the one that she talks about in her paper was when Jacob and Laban are parting ways, and this is Genesis.
31:53.
31:50. Okay, 31:53, and I'm pulling it up right in front of you. But basically, they're both going to swear their oaths. And so the NRSV says it this way: "May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us." So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice on the height, called his kinfolk to eat the bread. Blah blah blah. And so the question here is, and there is a part. It looks like the NRSV. Yeah, the NRSV takes out the reading that she's talking about. There is there's another statement, Elohim Avotehem, which means either God of their fathers or gods of their fathers. And so the question is,
right,
does God of Nahor and God of Abraham mean this is the one God who is both the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor? Or does this mean there's one God that's the God of Nahor and another God that is the God of Abraham? And the statement, the Elohim of their fathers, is ambiguous. It could be interpreted either way because Elohim can be plural or singular. And so depending on the lens you're bringing to this passage, you may, one, try to preserve the ambiguity, which when I worked in scripture translation for the LDS Church, we actually at one point wanted to make shirts that said maintain the ambiguity. The idea being that you don't want to make the decision for the reader, you want to pass on prerogative to make the interpretive decision to the reader. And so you can maintain the ambiguity, or you can decide for them, in which case you say, oh, this is referring to different gods, or this is referring to one God. So, and so she talks about how the Septuagint makes a decision about that, about how the Vulgate makes a decision about that, and then how modern translation, the King James Version, the RSV, the NRSV, the NIV, how translations, the translators make different decisions based on the lenses that they're bringing to the text. And when talking about Paul and the gods, if you go to 1 Corinthians 8, there's this famous passage where he says, and here's the NRSV UE, "Indeed, even though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, for whom are all things and for whom we exist." And there's some ambiguity there. Is Paul saying, oh yeah, these things that people call gods, but we know there's only one God? Is Paul saying that? Or is Paul saying, yeah, there are these gods all over the place, but as far as we're concerned, only one God matters to us?
Right.
Like, what lens are you bringing? Yeah. And I agree. That's precisely what he's saying. And the metaphor that I use in my paper is the Broncos. Like, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one. That was a lot easier to say back in the late '90s. But like the Raiders, they're not even a real football team. Like it's just the kind of rhetoric that we use to juice each other up and to make ourselves feel better than the other.
Yeah, I've had to do the same thing. I remember giving my first paper like in 2013 or 2014, and it was at this Paul and Judaism conference at HBU, or formerly Houston Baptist University. Now it's Houston Christian, I think. But I'd given this paper there, and I talked about the gods of Deuteronomy in relation to the interpretation of Romans 4. And interestingly, what this sort of older pastor scholar, had a PhD. I think he taught at some point, but he had pastored most of his adult life. He's like the older statesman, evangelical pastor in the pews looking out for these young heretically, I'm going to show these kids what for,
Yeah.
He immediately tried to go in on me in the Q&A time and say, well, clearly by Isaiah, it says that there is only one God. There is no God beside me. What are you talking about? That they were not monotheists. I said, wait a minute. I was like, that's just incomparability language. At the time I drove a Ford Focus. It's like me saying my Ford Focus is the only Ford Focus. There ain't no other Ford Focus out there. It's just mine. I'm not making an ontological claim about the oneness of my Ford Focus. And I had already made points that, look, Akkadian hymns do this to their deities too. It's like, there is but one God. Who amongst the gods is like you? It's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So this is just common rhetoric.
I've shared that on social media. The great Cairo hymn to Aten from Egypt. You read that, and that's even more emphatic than the stuff you find in Deutero Isaiah.
That's awesome example. Yeah.
So the first session was Hebrew Bible, and there were three of us: Deborah Scoggins Ballantyne, I presented, and also another wonderful scholar named Jennifer Singletary from Penn State University.
Excellent.
And her paper was called "The End of Hypostatization," or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About Israelite Polytheism. Yeah. And her paper was really cool. I didn't know what to expect with her paper. Either. But hypostatization is this idea that
I feel like you're stuttering when you say that word, but that's I'm sure you're not. It's a hell of a word.
I'm not. And that was something that she kept saying. She's like, I had to practice pronouncing all the words over and over again. But this idea of a hypostasis is, I don't know if it originates in Christological scholarship, or it probably comes from.
That's where it becomes a dominant category.
Yeah.
It's in the early Christological debates about a hypostasis of God that's still part of the one God, but it develops into this language of personhood in the counselor debates on Christology. But what happens is hypostasis then, because the Bible is. Now we have Christendom. We everyone's Orthodox Christian. You have the Orthodox readings of the Bible. So if you have any weird, God looking stuff back here, that's a hypostasis. That's just that's not a separate God, right?
I still don't understand what
one God.
What
so
this
is a fancy Greek word that means substance. But the idea of a hypostasis or hypostasis is like an avatar. It's an entity that is distinct from the main entity, but it only points back to the main entity.
Okay.
And so like a divine image is thought of as a hypostasis. And so when you have these texts that are talking about all these other gods, if you identify them all as hypostases of the main God, then that protects monotheism, because it means they're not autonomous, independent entities. They're just the avatars of the main God. And her paper
feels problematic considering that they fight each other. But okay.
Well, yeah, it's highly problematic. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'll interject something here. The ones that are normally this is helpful for Hebrew Bible stuff, because when Christian scholars want to talk about hypostases of God, they will go back, like the councils did, and talk about the wisdom of God. It appears as if wisdom is this second figure that has some sort of agency. It's described as if wisdom gets to create. Wisdom gets to play a role, but it's still the wisdom of God. So it's sort of personified. So is it an agent in and of itself, or is it just part of God? And so that's what we mean by, well, it's a hypostasis. It's like it's part of God, but it just appears as a separate agent. And so the name of God is another very important one in the Hebrew Bible. is that was very important all through early Judaism. This onomonology, this idea that the name has presence. It signifies presence. So you build a temple. Yahweh says, you build a temple for my name. The tabernacles where my name will dwell there.
Yeah.
And it's a real presence of the deity is there.
Right.
The Shekinah can be called the name, the glory of God, the kavod is often another one too, the glory of God. So these are all like hypostases. These are like, it appears like they're a second figure, but they're part of the one God. So that discourse dominates a lot of scholarship because they impose it on much more ancient Israelite stuff because they need it to be there.
And it functions as an explanation that cuts off any further interrogation because it's like there's some kind of relationship there, boom, hypostasis. And that means we're done talking about the relationship because we've already presupposed that whatever that relationship is, it is subsumed within our understanding, which is again based on Christological stuff. And so it's basically just a way of shellacking everything over with Christology so that we don't complicate things any further, which was really one of the main things I was trying to do in my book was show, hey, we can actually explain why people are thinking of these things this way, but it complicates Christology to do that. But she brought up some wonderful examples from Kuntilat Ajrud, some of the inscriptions there, where it refers to El, it refers to Adonai, it refers to Baal, and she complicates the assumption that these all must be hypostases of Adonai, and then talks about some really cool inscriptions from Elephantini.
Fascinating.
Yeah, there was a Jewish garrison that was stationed there at the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 4th centuries BCE, and they had a temple there. And like it was destroyed by the locals. And the governor there was like, yeah, you can rebuild your temple, but no animal sacrifices, only fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. And they have references to a variety of different deities there. And so who are sometimes just dismissed as hypostases. Also a phenomenal paper.
Her paper is great.
Yeah.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
And then, David, your section, Second Temple Judaism and Christian Origins, was the longer. We had 4 in there, didn't we?
That was 4. It was separated by a break. Yep.
Yeah. And so Emma Wasserman went right before you, and you could probably talk about her paper better than I can because you're a little more closely related to what she's doing.
Yeah. Well, her paper was called Pantheon, Polemics, and Intellectual Pressures, Reconsidering Paul's Pneuma. She left off the pneuma part for this paper and sort of restructured it a bit. But she was mainly talking about from a host of texts and comparing it to sort of the common intellectual context in philosophy in the Greco-Roman world, to say that Paul believed in a pantheon, very similar to the way the Greeks did. So it's this structured power. Think of like a pyramid or a hierarchy, a scala natura, as they call it, that I was talking about earlier, like a scaled hierarchy, and that this is ubiquitous.
You're talking about multi-level marketing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You got the CEO at the top, but
You got to have your sort of deity downlines. Otherwise,
yeah. What Emma's an incredible scholar because she has this encyclopedic knowledge of ancient philosophy. I tell you what, I am so jealous of those Stanley Stowers students because her and Robin Faith Walsh and others, Stephen Young, these guys know Greek philosophy backwards and forwards. They are great. And I'm so glad to have them because I have a ton to learn from her still. But she masterfully showed that, like, look, these pantheons, Paul's pantheon is actually no different in like structure, in the way that it's imagined in tiers. And there's all kinds of like discourse and rhetoric around that and navigating that, but everyone is sort of on that page, you know? And so it's not, it's more of, I think she talked about anxieties about affinity, like the likeness. If, it's, you get anxious that it sounds too much like, you know, your compadres over here. So you got to tweak things a little bit to sound unique. And so these things that may sound radically unique in Paul aren't really. And so she's doing a high level critical readings, doing like talking about literary producers and shared repertoires of literary producers of the period. And Paul, the way she's critically discussing Paul is that it's just a varied model of a pantheon, you know? That's what's happening here. It's just one varied model of scholars looking back critically. Oh, these are all pantheons. That's all this is. Yeah. And so the way she talks about these literary producers in that context has much more to do about anxieties towards affinities with others. You know, to have some unique voice, to have some you're a religious expert, in the words of Heidi White. So. This is he's a religious expert in the ancient Mediterranean. He's carving out his own place, his own voice. And so he might tweak things this way, you know, well, they need to be dealt with this way, or that this lower tier there's a battle going on over here. But the whole time for critical scholarship is, let's just admit these are all pantheons. Okay. Yeah.
And this is something.
There is no radically other view of the cosmos going on, you know, and that's not a thing.
And that's a big point to make here, is that a common theme in all of this is when we look at the relationship of the Jewish, Christian, Hebrew Bible literature to the literature and the societies around it, it's not a revolutionary departure. And and particularly with monotheism, what scholarship wants is this to be a revolutionary break. Right. This, you know, just sudden, instantaneous mutation that nobody could have seen coming, or revolutionary monotheism, or all these things. Because what that means is, this is divine in origin.
This is special. This
is not just an incremental elaboration on everything that came before. Which is, in reality, when you look at the data, that's what you see. They're not departing wildly from what's going on around them. They're just saying short, small, little deviations from what's going on around them. And so I think that's one of the important things that this conference is going to show, is that there is not this radical revolutionary departure, but it is carrying on very similar traditions, just incrementally elaborating on them.
I think it's one of the things that's that I think would be surprising to most people. I think a lot of people would be more comfortable admitting an idea of polytheism in Hebrew Bible times, in Old Testament times, and less comfortable with that being a part of New Testament, Pauline beliefs. And I think that's the part that I think is the big revelation from what I'm understanding from you guys, is that, like, there's no, we've said it before, but there's no part of the Bible that doesn't have polytheistic belief.
I think one of the things we talked about, I would agree with that. One of the things we frequently brought up at the conference was the threshold of monotheism. Where do we identify when we finally have monotheism? And if you go back 150 years in scholarship, it's like, oh, Abraham was the first monotheist. And then a couple generations later, Moses was the first monotheist. Then a couple generations later, Deutero-Isaiah is the first monotheist. And so our generation is coming on what I hope is the tail end of the era of Deutero-Isaiah. They're constantly trying to hold that threshold against the data and say, no, we have it by this time. And we're in addition to just blasting past Deutero-Isaiah, we're blasting past the New Testament also. We're not waiting for that era. We're saying, no, it's not in Deutero-Isaiah. It's not in the Greco-Roman period literature. It's not even in the New Testament. And I think that's going to be another important contribution of this volume is we're going to point out, the question of where the threshold is the wrong question to begin with. But two, it's definitely not anywhere in the Bible. And I think Paula Fredrickson, who has the paper after yours, did a wonderful job of talking about her frustrations with the use of the framework of monotheism and its abuse in light of the fact that it's just not identifiable anywhere in the Bible, including in the New Testament and even within early Christianity.
100%.
I think it's funny that when you mentioned the pushing forward of this threshold, I am no Bible scholar. I am no expert in the Bible, but even I look at Moses and I'm like, you guys remember in the story of Moses that the bad guys had gods that had powers too, right? That's just right there in the story.
Yeah.
I don't know. How could you possibly that's about as obvious a thing as I can imagine. And so the fact that what it speaks to my mind is how important it was to these scholars to maintain this dogma of monotheism.
Yeah. We all saw Steve Martin and Martin Short throw their staffs down and they became snakes. And in fact, somebody brought up that this generation is a generation that was raised thinking about the story of the Exodus based on the Prince of Egypt. That's Prince of Egypt. That's the lens so many come to it through. And in fact, I've heard people argue, well, Moses' brother gave him his ring, and it's like, that's the Prince of Egypt.
That's from a cartoon. That's not from the Bible.
Yeah. And, Whitney Houston is impeccable in the soundtrack, but that's not the text of the Bible.
With Paula's paper, just real quick, for Paula, what else can you say that she has not already said many, many times about monotheism? And she basically was saying that, her article, Philo, Herod, Paul, and the Many Gods of Ancient Jewish Monotheism is a masterpiece.
That's Harvard Theological Review from
HTR,
like a year or two ago. Yeah.
Just excellent piece. But lots of the points that she's made before, but she's been going after for a very long time the AEHCC types that use language like Jewish biblical monotheism, that ancient, talking about New Testament authors and saying, oh, they're using Jewish biblical monotheism, and they'll talk about, well, faithful Jews, who read their Bible, will be monotheists. And it's just like, every time you hear this, it's like the Christian exceptionalism is whoa, it's wow. It's like, oh my goodness. And you think in a post-Holocaust world where there's been droves of writing in what does it mean to do hermeneutics of texts that even have anti-Jewish stuff tinging in them. How do we read them and how do we be honest with them and critical of them and interrogate them in a post-Holocaust world? And there's so much of this monotheism talk runs into this problem. And this runs into Robin's paper too.
Yeah. So and Stevens to some degree as well, I think.
Yeah. So Robin's Faith Walsh's paper, just incredible as well. Just really great paper. She did a paper on Jesus in Berlin, on monotheism and origins at the God, my French is terrible. How do you say it, Dan?
I said fin de cycle, and
fin de cycle, something like that. My French is terrible. So
mine is too.
But Robbins is impeccable. So, her paper was brilliant because she had a very unique paper in our conference, and I almost wish we had, and in the future we will. But she brought an example of, okay, let's see on the ground, how is this term functioning in the 18th and 19th centuries? Like specifically in Germany, in Berlin, look at these German scholars, the way they're employing the term. And she shows the history and the development of this in really brilliant ways that shows the supersessionistic agendas in the rise of monotheism as it grows in that period rhetorically.
As an anthropological category, that's kind of the heyday of the anthropologist, and monotheism becomes a main category for kind of ordering the development of humanity in this evolutionary teleological scheme.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that sort of in my sort of encounters with biblical scholarship or anthropological scholarship. I've heard people say that monotheism was a big turn in sort of the development of human belief systems, etc.
Yeah, it's radical exceptionalism and essentialism. It's like, well, now we've reached this pinnacle of monotheism, and we're at the heights of and all these little pagans that still worship all their little gods are somewhere under us. They're othered,
right.
So we've evolved to the supreme race, so to speak, who understand this. And there's that
value judgment again.
Right.
Of course, the value, it's tied. You can't separate. She proves pretty substantively that you can't separate that rhetoric in German scholarship from that supersessionistic essentialist project. It's all wrapped up with it, and it's used rhetorically to function that way as well.
I mean, I've heard it used to be, I remember when I was in school, I took a class, and it was a philosophy class, and this was 20 years ago or something, but not that long ago. But my professor at the time was sort of looking down on all of these silly polytheists, and it becomes a vehicle for racism and for sort of putting down of other cultures, which is really probably not great.
Yeah, one of the points she makes is she was talking about the fits and starts and the zeal from like the 18th to 19th century to discover these natural laws that govern the world. And so monotheism is like the culmination of that they've found out, and she even talked about Jesus as culmination, it's like we've arrived, versus those others that haven't. And
we solved religion. Congratulations, everybody.
Yeah. That's literally what it was.
Literally. I mean, so she makes the very clear point at that point. So what taxonomic value does monotheism have at all when you know that's the way that it's functioning? That's the way it's been appropriated and employed, So I thought that was great. I thought her paper was needed at our conference.
Yeah, and that leads into the last section had two papers in it that we don't have time to get deep into, but Stephen Young, who was participating over Zoom because he was ill, his is entitled Monotheism as a Competitive Strategy, Athenagoras, the Pseudo-Clementine Literature and Manufacturing Christian Exceptionalism. And he didn't get into Pseudo-Clementine literature in the presentation, but he talked about Athenagoras and some other early Christians who were basically using the claim of monotheism to try to manufacture this idea that we're different, we're revolutionary, we're radical, and we're better. So that identity marker and that value judgment, where they're using monotheism already to do what Robin points out is being done in the 19th century in an effort to try to distinguish themselves, and primarily because they're on the losing end of imperialism, and they need to find a way to to pump themselves up.
What era was Athenagoras? Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, this is late
Yeah,
2nd century CE, beginning of the 3rd century CE. So this is right after the New Testament has been written. It's still kind of crystallizing, and these are the earliest what they call apologists, who are basically starting in the middle of the 2nd century CE. You get a bunch of Christians who are philosophers, who are thinkers, who are trying to make Christianity palatable for the Greco-Roman intelligentsia. They're going to kind of meld and merge the philosophical frameworks of the day with Christianity to try to argue, hey, Christianity is compatible with all this. In fact, Christianity is the best manifestation of everything that you're already saying.
And explicit exceptionalism in Athenagoras. I mean, going to the extreme. I mean, calling things like pagans, they're all, pornea. That's all they're doing in their worship of their gods. Yeah. And it's like, we have the right readings of Homer. We have the right readings of this. Everyone else is sort of, they're seen as like the filthy other, Yeah.
I mean, exceptionalism and othering is not new in any religious practice. That is sort of a feature of most religions that I've encountered, I would say.
But I think one of his important points is that when you start talking about other cults to other deities that way, but our cult to our deity this way, it's, this is all wrapped up in their monotheism. So he's showing the rhetorical function of it. It's like in your face and brutally obvious then. It might not be so much to someone who doesn't know the history of it in Christian, in early church fathers and afterwards. But if you know that history, you'd be more prone to catch it in the more developing periods, later. Yeah. And so the exceptionalism involved and what you can sneak in with that exceptionalism gets really dangerous,
Well, there's so much more to talk about, but alas, we need to cut this off. So everything else is going to go to our patrons, and that's going to include there's one more paper that we needed to talk about. Is that right?
So we've got Josiah Bisbee's paper. Josiah is another one of the organizers of this conference and a longtime friend of David's. And he had a phenomenal paper entitled The Divine Counsel, Divine Multiplicity, and Gradations of Divinity in Late Antique Midrash.
Oh, yeah.
So if you've been waiting for the rabbinic literature, his is all about that.
Epic.
Nice. And I also want to talk about sort of situating all of this that we've been talking about within sort of modern scholarship and sort of get if you guys have, you're not allowed to answer this now, but if you have a shakedown of where modern scholarship is with all of this, I'd love to talk about it, but that's for our patrons only, I'm afraid. If you become a $10 a month patron, all of the after parties are available on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Data Over Dogma. You can also join at the $5 a month level and receive an early and ad-free version of every show. So we encourage you to do that if that's appealing to you. If you want to reach out to us, contact at dataoverdogmapod.com is the address. David, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, guys.
And we will talk to you all again next week.
Bye, everybody.
Data Over Dogma is a member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. It is a production of Data Over Dogma Media, LLC, copyright 2024, all rights reserved.